We can get started now. I would like to introduce you all to Mimi Cronin from Planned Parenthood. She works with education and outreach in a lot of different areas. So she wears a few different hats, but a big part of her job is kind of education. So we have Mimi from the Rochester Planned Parenthood Clinic here with us today, and she is going to be talking about the Circles of Sexuality.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, so happy that you all can join me today and that you invited me. Super excited to talk about this topic and just share some info. So I'm going to share my screen. Well, you know what? First, I'm going to pull up PowerPoint that I have. All right, now I'm going to share my screen. Are you all seeing a PowerPoint?
It's coming. There you go.
Yeah, there it is.
Awesome. So, like Grace mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the circles of sexuality. So the best thing to do is to dive right in to what they are. We have defined sexuality into 6 different categories that a person can have. So I'm going to go through them from clockwise, starting at the top, and then we'll dive more deeply into a couple of them throughout this. But the first one being sexual and reproductive health. So a person has the capacity or ability or lack of to reproduce. This also includes our feelings and experiences with reproduction, behaviors and attitudes that play a part into the sexual health and enjoyment. This also includes factual information about sexual anatomy, activities, reproduction, contraception, STI prevention, self-care, among other things. So that's our first circle, and typically that's one that people think a lot about when we refer to sexuality, especially with our bodies. The next one would be sexual. You know what? I'm going to go counterclockwise. I just realized. So just to follow along. Next one being sexual behaviors and practices. So what we or others actively do sexually to enact or express our sexuality. Who is doing what when it comes to their own body parts and or those of sexual partners, toys, or other objects. The third being sexual romantic orientation and gender identity. So these are our feelings, sense, or understanding of who we are sexually. This includes gender identity, which is our internal sense of being a woman, man, neither, both, or a different way of expressing gender altogether. This also includes the ways that we express those feelings. In addition to our sexual and romantic orientation, this is what gender of people, if any, we feel romantic or sexual desire for. Our sense of being queer, straight, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, and so forth. There's so many different ways a person can describe what they feel about others, and it's totally up to themselves to make that choice. The fourth being intimacy. This is the ability and desire for emotional closeness with other people. Aspects of intimacy can include sharing, caring, emotional risk-taking, and vulnerability. The fifth being awareness or sensuality, which is our awareness and experience of our bodies as a whole and other people's bodies. Sensuality enables us to feel good about our bodies, how they look, how they feel, and what they can do. It also allows us to enjoy pleasurable experiences that our bodies can give ourselves and others. And our last is sexual power and agency. Power within is derived from sense of self-worth and understanding of one's preferences and values. This comes from knowing these other circles about ourselves and being able to utilize them and enable ourselves to experience sexual well-being and health. So as I mentioned, we are going to really dive into sexual and romantic orientation and gender identity today, just because that's one that there's a lot of confusion surrounding it, nuances, and can be really great to just know more deeply so that we were able to understand people in our community and give them the respect and care that they deserve. So with that, Gender, binary, spectrum, what is it? The LGBT literacy is full of acronyms, letters, words, vocab, and so many other things. We're going to spend this presentation breaking down some of those into bite-sized chunks, but this will also be a time for us to tackle biases, ignorance, or just general uneasiness when it comes to these new topics we might not be familiar with. And as I go through this PowerPoint, feel free to stop me at any point if you want to ask a question, have a comment, or need something for clarification. I'm pretty bad at monitoring the chat when I'm presenting because I can't see it. So feel free to come off Zoom. You can always save questions for that, or come off mute, stay on the Zoom. You can always save questions for the end, or if Grace feels comfy reading things out loud from the chat, that can work too. But just so you know, if you put something in the chat and I don't see it right away, I'm just a mess at paying attention to those sometimes.
I can keep an eye on the chat, no worries.
Perfect. So when it comes to binaries, this is something that Western culture has created and we've existed in for a long time. And so when it comes to gender, we see that being in two binaries of man and woman, girl and boy, female and male. But this also extends into other areas of our identities too that put us in boxes and make things more rigid. And with that though, things aren't as rigid as a binary. It turns out that lots of things do not exist in binary, but perhaps a spectrum with male and female at either end, sometimes a sort of line of ambiguity in between. But you can even take this a step further and look at gender and sexuality as a big pool of colors, like an XYZ axis, where we find ourselves on a point throughout all these, but we're also free to move around because of how you make your gender be a few shades different from someone else who might identify the same as you. And with that too, there are so many different ways that we present our gender and expression and falls into different categories. So it's not the same that they need to be paired together in certain ways. You can see here on the screen, this is a gender elephant. And we have it broken down into 5 different categories, being their gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, physical attractionness, and emotional attractiveness. And a person can be anywhere at any of these different lines along the way. And like I mentioned, they don't have to be locked in with another. So just because one person might have their gender identity as a woman and expression feminine, but then potentially attracted to other women doesn't necessarily mean that a person with the same attraction has to have the same identity. We're all able to exist in different shades of this. So just going through a couple of those different categories that we talked through to understand them better. The first one being sex assigned at birth. So this is something that a lot of people are familiar with because this is when a person is born, what we decide their sex is. And a lot of times that is then linked to their gender. But we need to step away from that term of biological sex because it implies that there is one specific way to be, one way or the other. But in reality, there are so many different ways that sex can present at birth. And so a few terms to know. On the right, you can see I have listed AMAB. This means a person who's assigned male at birth, or AFAB, a person assigned female at birth. And a lot of times this is dependent on their genitals, those physical characteristics that we see when a person's born. But at the same time, there are actually 28 different physical ways that a person can present their sex. And this is based on chromosomes. So if we're familiar with that X and Y chromosome that a person can have, an XX, but there's so many different ways that that can actually happen in a body as well. We can see XXX, 1X, 1Y, different ways that just the genes make up, which is why it's so important to not even see this in a binary because there's different ways. And then that also can lead to different gender expressions that a person has throughout their life. Sorry, my dog is trying to get out of my lap. So with that too, an example of what we see and how even just looking at the physical characteristics don't show what's truly happening in the body is Caster Semenya. So for those of you who might know of her, she is an Olympian. She's a woman assigned female at birth. But she's been banned by the Olympic Committee from running due to high testosterone levels in her body. And so that's typically high testosterone levels is what people would assume happens in a male body, a person that might have an X and Y chromosomes. But Castor, this is the way her body was born. This is the way that she has presented her whole entire life. And so for, groups and organizations to tell her that she's not a woman because of these testosterone levels just show that people are able to interpret gender at different times in different ways, and a lot of times done so in a way that might oppress other people in groups. And so with that, going further, gender is cultural specific. So what is gender? This is a question we ask time and time again. Maybe we don't always get an answer. What we do know is that the concept of gender is socially constructed. This social construct of gender is another way of defining gender roles. In other words, our expectations of those assigned males or females at birth, people to be masculine or feminine in gender expression, respectively, is socially influenced and defined. Gender is defined uniquely by individual cultures. For example, in some cultures, it's considered socially acceptable, perhaps even normative, for men to stay at home and raise children, while women work outside the home, and in other cultures that might be flipped. Definitions of masculinity and femininity are influenced by cultural, social, ethnic, political, economical, spiritual, and psychological phenomena and norms. Same thing though, gender is time dependent. So within a specific culture, those definitions and expectations that we might have on genders change over time. For example, in American culture, the style of dress that was considered the epitome of femininity in the 1950s might not be considered that epitome today. And on the flip side, seeing what our standards are today might be considered something that was radical and inappropriate 50 years ago. Our expressions of gender and how we ascribe to it and perform it have all changed and grown over time, just like our social ideology of it. Similarly, gender is something we do, and we're doing it all the time, even if we're not recognizing it or realizing it. But we're fulfilling gender roles by just thinking of what should we be doing or looking like at a specific time. And even in that sense, gender is something that we might actively deny or something we might aspire to attain. It's a fluid process that we're constantly working to do and to, again, meet time and time again with social standards or lack thereof. Gender is socially constructed. So once again, overall, the concept of gender is just dependent on the communities that we live in, based on time, culture, location, and thought process. So how you and I perceive gender right now could be different at different places across the world, different times, and just even different based on who we are in contact with and what we're exposed to. So with that, kind of want to dive into some terms for gender that are helpful to know, so that way as we grow and learn, we just have this in our wheelhouse of understanding. So the first one being transgender. This is a person who identifies with a gender other than what they were assigned to them at birth. So a lot of the times when a person is born, we look at those physical characteristics and decide what gender they're going to be raised as, what gender their community is going to recognize them as. But as that person grows, they might realize that that's not what they are. That doesn't feel right for them. So they decide to move into the gender that fits them more better, or is truly their gender. On the flip side, cisgender is a person who identifies with the gender that they were assigned to them at birth. I myself am cisgendered, so that means when I was born, people looked at me, said woman, that feels good for me, that is correct, and that's how I still present today. Also within gender, though, we have the term non-binary. So this is a person who identifies outside that binary. So as we had learned, man and woman, these can be seen as genderqueer, bigender, agender, gender fluid, or pangender. These are all different instances of people who have multiple genders or are able to move fluidly from one gender to the next. This might seem like a lot, or the idea of changing genders perhaps is even on a daily basis might be outside some of the understanding of our grasp, but it's important to remember that everyone does gender differently. And we all have space on that color palette, as I described earlier. So some people just want to sample all the different colors as much as possible. So the next part to talk about is gender identity. So non-binary may be a new term for us, but non-binary genders have existed throughout history and outside Western culture for as long as human civilization has existed. Some examples of that is Mushi. This is the indigenous Zapotec people of cultures in Mexico where they have a traditional third gender. And these are people who are assigned male at birth, but often at a young age come into a feminine third gender that combines both male and female qualities. One that some people might be familiar with is Two-Spirit. It's relatively a new umbrella term for a wide variety of non-binary identities that exist within Native American culture, First Nation traditions. These identities are often have had long historic specifics to their respective communities. Therefore, Two-Spirit is not a homogeneous term that does not simply mean non-binary, but a person who is non-binary with First Nation descent. Some Two-Spirit people consider themselves to be part of the LGBTQ plus community, while others do not. And that's why it's so important to allow people who are part of those communities to decide what feels good for them and what is good for their gender. Continuing on, Buji culture is from Indonesia. These people have recognized 3 sexes and 5 separate gender identities. So these combinations of sexes and genders all have different roles in society and how they do gender through them. So it's just showing that, once again, it's truly Western culture that just has for so long seen it as one or the other, while there are other cultures out there that have had 5, 10, 15 plus genders and have completely always viewed it as such. Lastly, Mao is a traditional gender expression Hawaiian culture that embodies both female and male identities. It's essentially considered being in between. It does not define sexual preference or outward gender expression. Historically, Mao people have been healers, educators, and keepers of cultural knowledge. So showing too how gender plays such a big role into the different cultures of people and the roles that the people hold within their communities based on their gender. So what's different though is our gender expression. So gender expression is the way that people externally express themselves and their gender. This can be done through hairstyle, clothing, makeup, and behavior. It does not have to relate to somebody's gender identity. So what they feel about themselves inside does not necessarily mean that they need to present that way for society and community to validate them and recognize what their gender identity is. Some examples of that is we see feminine gender expression, masculine, androgynous, butch, femme. Butch and femme are terms that are used in lesbian communities for women and is a way that lesbian women present themselves, whether that be more feminine or masculine. But those words aren't used so much in cis culture, but they are still ways that we can describe gender expression. So with that, sexuality tends to be where we find this alphabet soup of identities. For example, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, but these can all also be put under the umbrella of queer. I will say here that not every LGBT person wants to identify as queer or feels good about that word, but it has been a word utilized more recently and reclaimed as just an umbrella term to talk about all of our different orientations and expressions. So the next part I want to dive into is sexual orientation. So this is what part of our six circles of sexuality that we feel for other people. And this can be broken down into 2 different categories: our sexual orientation, which is the desire for intimate and sexual relationships that we feel with the same gender, another gender, or multiple genders. And then also romantic orientation describes an individual's pattern of romantic attraction based on the person's gender. These can vary, they can be the same, they can go hand in hand. Once again, that's truly up to a person to decide what feels good when they're identifying themselves with their orientation. So the next thing that I wanted to dive into as well was pronouns. So pronouns is a word that takes the place of a noun. And we all utilize pronouns, whether or not we realize it. But it's also important to know what other people's pronouns are and what feels good for them to be used. So especially as I was just saying that, our gender expression does not have to match our identity. And a lot of the times pronouns go with what, or just off the top of our head, we think matches that expression a person has, but just because their expression is one thing does not necessarily mean that they use a pronoun that we might typically associate with that type of expression. So taking a step back to English class, like I mentioned, a pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun. She, her, hers, he, him, his are all its examples of this. There are also they, them, their pronouns, which is a gender neutral pronoun and one that people can use. But there's also even other gender neutral pronouns we can see on the list. And that's why it's so important to just know what a person utilizes, because then it can really validate and make a person feel comfortable having a conversation with somebody if they know that they're being respected and just seen for who they are. So another chart and getting back into that, English of it, we know how to use he, she in saying she is speaking or I listen to her. They, them is very much the same. So saying something like they are speaking, I listen to them, they are sitting over there. Z is very similar to they, them. So if a person were to be like, Z is speaking, I listen to here or Zir. The backpack belongs to Zir's. These might sound a little funny the first time that we try them out, or a little uncomfortable for many reasons. The one being that they're not often used if we don't know a person that utilizes those pronouns, but it's important to try our best. And with that too, how we can normalize pronouns is in introductions. So when we introduce ourselves to somebody new, saying their name. So I would say, I am Mimi and my pronouns are she, hers, including them in name tags, utilizing them in email signatures. Zoom name, you can see on mine, I have them in my little name thing. And social media bios, that's a very popular place too. Not only does this help know people's pronouns, so that way we're not always having to ask, but we can just see it. But then it also just helps normalize it. So that way, as people are transitioning potentially into new pronouns, it creates a comfortable space for them to explore that and be able to be seen and heard. So pronoun etiquette, use the person's pronouns, avoid assuming anyone's pronouns. If we don't know pronouns, it's always safe to go with they and them before we truly have the knowledge of it. We're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. That's part of learning. But the best thing to do is that you're trying. And so with that, how can a person be respectful? Observing respectful terminology, saying gay instead of a gay, transgender and saying a transgender, because we recognize that there is so much more to a person than just one part of their identity, and that does not make them a singular thing. Also just changing to some updated language, transitioning when a person is moving from one gender to the next instead of saying sex change. That can be kind of outdated language that doesn't feel good for a lot of people. Saying name in pronouns instead of real name or preferred pronouns. That's just kind of a small microaggression that might exist if we're telling someone, oh, their preferred pronouns. No, that is their pronouns. It's not that they're preferred, it's what they are. And then finally, too, the next slide I wanted to show is to make sure we're not using slurs or defamatory language. Just wanted to give a content warning because there are some on here that are a little intense. But however, some members of LGBTQI plus communities are reclaiming these words, especially queer. That's one that a lot of people feel good using. But it's also important to know that that's for that community to use. Cis straight people don't have the right to use these words because they've been used as weapons in the past and harmful against the queer community. But if a person who is queer feels good using any of these words, then that's up to them to be able to choose to do so. Are there any questions? That is the end. I know it was a lot of info at once, which is so valid to have to take time to take this in. but it's always a great step to just start learning into it. And stop sharing my screen. I see I didn't miss any questions in the chat. That's good.
Do you happen to, this is fascinating to me because my background is in languages and linguistics. Do you happen to speak any other languages and know how what they use for like a third single pronoun?
I do not speak any other languages, so I can't answer that question. But off the top of my head, I know, like, especially in languages like French and Spanish, there are a lot of gendered ways that they speak that we don't see a lot in English, just
Right.
in nouns. And there has been movements to move towards like gender inclusive words. So a great example we see all the time is Latinx. And so that's taking out that Latino, Latina, and putting an X instead and recognizing that a person of Latin descent doesn't have to fall into the male or female categorization of that word. And I think that's the only example I can really give because, yeah, I don't speak another language, but I can look more into it. And I know that I work with people that are really into understanding language and how gender plays into it. So they might have some more examples, and I can send that to Grace, who can send it out to the group after.
I was just curious because I just recently found out that in German, because I have family in Germany, and I was trying to explain that our youngest is non-binary, and I said literally non-binary, and they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about, because to them, like, binary is just like computers, you know, zeros and ones. So it didn't make any sense. They were like, why are you talking about mathematics? Apparently they say diverse, which is like interesting, you know, a German pronunciation of diverse. So for non-binary, the word is diverse, but they didn't even know. I mean, my host sister didn't even know what pronouns they would use. She's like, well, I'm not really a language person. And I'm like, well, but you use pronouns all the time, whether you realize it or not. So I was just curious. And she was like, well, I don't really know anyone who uses those. And I was like, okay. So
yeah, and that's so great of a point that you bring up, that gender is different in all different cultures. And while we know that, you know, these types of people exist all over the world, there might just be different ways that they express themselves and feel good that doesn't translate well to other languages because, yeah, we don't have the same thing. Also, I just love the idea of you telling them about math and numbers in their language.
So we recently received something from the Mayo Clinic Sexual Health Program, and it was about myths about transgender. And I thought that was really helpful. I think the head of the department sent that out, but the myths, and I don't know if you're familiar with those about transgender.
I don't think I've seen that pamphlet, but there are lots of myths and like harmful stereotypes, especially about transgender individuals, especially like common ones that we see a lot, especially in youth, is that they're confused, that they don't know what they really want. But in reality, we as humans really develop our genders when we're around like the ages of 3 to 5. Psychologically is when we start to process that. So young people know what they want and how they feel. And then we also see a lot of harmful stereotypes about people who transition later in life, that they're doing it maliciously or doing it with intent to harm others. And that's just such a negative stereotype, and also really hurts a person and, you know, just our ability to provide equal access for people who are trans. I don't know if you had anything specific that you wanted to ask about or bring up.
Well, I think it's anything that's non-binary. People think it's a choice that person makes. That's a myth. That, you know, they wouldn't necessarily choose that. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is like knowing when and who we are. So a lot of times we see that too with like sexual orientation, that a person would choose to feel one way about genders and others. And I think especially it's hard because in our society we live rigid binaries that it takes a long time for people to realize who they are, because they have to fight back against what they've been told, how they've been raised, and what typical expectations are, especially too, we don't have representation in media for young people to be able to see that. It might be later in life that maybe that's the first time they've ever met another person like them, met someone in the LGBT community. And it takes time to realize that's truly who they are, because they just maybe never knew it was an option or knew that it existed, but maybe deep down they knew that they were different from others, that they felt something inside them that wasn't how they were truly being treated, but just because of not having that access or knowledge, especially we see that in like small communities, it might take time for people to realize who they are. So it might seem like they're choosing to become themselves when really they've been that way this whole time. It just took some extra years to figure it out.
So Mimi, you work for Planned Parenthood, which is known largely for offering birth control, and we think of that as a fairly like straight issue, preventing pregnancy. But can you talk a little bit about what Planned Parenthood offers the LGBTQIA community?
Totally, that's a great question. So right off the bat, we strive ourselves to offer inclusive and stigma-free care. So at the end of the day, most people need to have reproductive health care, regardless of what their gender is, their sexual orientation. And we want Planned Parenthood to be a place where a person can come and feel good about that. A lot of the times people might go to different primary physician care people and might get some sort of stigma, microaggressions given towards them because of who they are. So we really work hard to make sure that our clinic staff is open and accepting, that we're utilizing terms and terminology and just information that isn't blocking off anyone from getting that care. So that's right off the bat. But then of course too, we make sure to offer any sort of birth control that a person might need. We recognize that not all women have the potential to carry to pregnancy, that not only women can do that too. So we're making sure that anybody who needs, whether that be birth control, different exams, are getting that. We also make sure that we offer transgender hormone therapy to anybody who wants and needs it. So transgender hormone therapy is an option for people if they want to start to transition into certain gender expressions that might help with having different hormones in their body, whether that be raising or lowering certain ones. A lot of places, in order to get onto transgender hormone therapy, a person might need to visit a therapist, a psychologist. They might need to have letters from these people saying that, yes, this is what they truly want or need. At Planned Parenthood, we don't ask for any of that stuff because, one, we recognize it as not only a barrier, a financial barrier, but also just a mental toll that a person has to go through these different hoops and things to jump over in order to prove that who they are and who they want to be. So if a person were to come to Planned Parenthood and want to start testosterone or start estrogen, we don't ask for any sort of documentation or having somebody else sign off on it, because we know at the end of the day, people who are in those bodies know those bodies best, and what they want is what we'll give them. So if you or any of yourselves know of somebody who is looking to start transgender hormone therapy and is struggling to find out how to make it accessible, Planned Parenthood is a great option, because at every one of our clinics in Minnesota, you can just go in and get your first dosage, no hassle, no problems.
Mimi, what's the age limit on that?
I know in Minnesota that a person at the age of 13 can start visiting a doctor without any sort of guardian like involvement. I guess I don't know the specific ages that a person can start certain hormone therapy. There are in certain states like legislation against that. So for example, like Georgia, a person under the age of 18 is not allowed to have any sort of hormone therapy, but that's really a conversation that has to happen between a doctor and the person receiving it, just because we do recognize that youth are going through puberty and wanting to make sure that putting hormones into the body, if other things are happening, we just want that person to be in balance. But I know people have started as young as age 7, 8, because that's when bodies are typically releasing hormones anyway. whether that be estrogen or testosterone, a person going through puberty, those different changes that youth have. But it's just really important to be able to talk to the doctor, care physician, so that way we're getting the right ones into that person's body at the right time, and we're not overwhelming their body with so many different changes at once, because that can also be intense and not the best thing.
So,
But I think it's also important just to be aware and keep in mind that hormone therapy is used not only with persons who are interested in sexual change, but also just for the maintenance of a person because of the different developmental aspects of people. And so there are, the therapy can be not necessarily for a person to have a move towards a transition from one to a sex to another or expression, but it's also just for the development and the health of a particular person, where they may remaining in their particular or either designated or decided sex, whether it's male or female or in between.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Gary. So as I had mentioned earlier today, we were talking about, different ways that chromosomes present in a body, and how there are so many different ways that an intersex person might exist. So like you said, Gary, just because a person's on hormone therapy doesn't necessarily mean that they're transgender or moving into a gender that fits them better. Sometimes it is just for maintenance. Sometimes we see that a person's body maybe isn't producing any testosterone or any estrogen, and they want to begin that. So there's so many different ways that hormone therapy can benefit any person.
so Mimi, we've talked a lot about the hormone treatments. What kind of support system does Planned Parenthood provide, especially for anybody, but I'm thinking especially for younger people who think they want to start this? What kind of support systems are there for that?
That's a great question. Right off the bat, most of our clinics have educators in-house. So like myself, I work with 3 other educators in the Rochester area. Not right now, but usually we work in the office, COVID. But if a person ever wants to talk to one of us, we are trained in different counseling skills, different ways to ask a person, figure out what they truly want. And we're there to offer not only support, but also resources for other community partners who might be doing some more of that work. So while none of us are like trained or licensed, therapists, psychologists, we're able to talk through people and figure out how to get them the help that they need, whether that be referring them to an inclusive counselor or therapist that can provide that more support. Or there are different organizations throughout Southern Minnesota that are specific to aiding trans and queer youth. So yeah, they are more than welcome to talk to one of us. Also, of course, our clinic staff is really great at talking through some more of the technical things with them, but then we work really hard to form partnerships in the different communities that we and Planned Parenthood are located in, so that way people can find the resources that they truly need.
And do you encourage that? You said earlier that if you wanted to come to Planned Parenthood and get a hormone shot, just walk in and we'll give you one, or that's the way I interpreted what you said.
Yes, Planned Parenthood doesn't require any sort of documentation or proving that a person wants and needs what they deserve. So like I mentioned, a lot of places, they might require a person to meet with 3 different therapists and get a letter signed off. And that's just such a barrier, and especially a financial barrier and a time barrier too, that it's going to take a long time for that to happen. But we at Planned Parenthood know that a person knows themselves best, and they're the only person that should be deciding what's happening to their body. So we're not going to make them prove any sort of thing to us, because we know that they know what's best for them.
But you, I don't want to be argumentative here, and I don't mean to be, but you also acknowledge the fact that children who are going through puberty may not fully recognize where they want to be. They may think they want to be there, and maybe they need to be there, but they need some some support system around making that decision, or it seems to me that they would, but.
Well, so what I had said is that psychologically, it is proven that people start developing ideas about their gender between the ages of 3 and 5. So when we're 3, we start to realize, you know, this is what feels good to wear. This is what feels good to act like. This is who I want to be as a person. What I had said about children is that sometimes bodies might not be ready to handle certain hormones at certain times because, you know, puberty happens between the typical ages of 10 and 13, starting that. So that would be a conversation between a physician, somebody that has that licensure. I don't have any sort of knowledge about, you know, the medical field of prescribing hormones or starting those treatments. So that would need to happen between the patient and the doctor and should only be happening between those two people.
So just to finish the conversation, so if somebody came to you and wanted a hormone injection, they would have to bring a prescription for that with them?
No, so Dick, Mimi is an educator. She
Oh, I
works a
understand.
job really similar to me, but every clinic has nurses and usually there's like a nurse practitioner or PA on site. So Mimi doesn't see patients, but they see patients, and this would be a decision made by a licensed, educated medical team.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's like anything, you know, when I was younger, I went into a Planned Parenthood clinic and I had in mind what I wanted, but I talked to a doctor when I was there. Or actually I talked to a nurse, and I ended up walking out with something different from what I went in seeking because that was the right option for me. So, you know, you're still working with a medical team to figure out what's right for everyone based on their body. For example, they really don't prescribe oral contraception to people who smoke. Or maybe I have that wrong. Maybe it's they don't prescribe the implant to people who smoke. But you know, you're working with a medical team to figure out what is right for your body in that moment. So it's not quite as like walk in and get it. You still have to meet with a doctor.
That was my question. Thank you.
I will say that I love Planned Parenthood a whole bunch, and so I work with them and I try to keep up with everything they do. And I really, really like being a part of this organization. So thank you, Mimi, for coordinating that.
Yeah, Grace is one of our great volunteers, top tier.
I have another question, Mimi, and that is in regards to, it's a little bit broader than we're focused on, you know, trans or our sexuality per se. And that is, what are some of the challenges that Planned Parenthood is facing right now, and particularly the kind of negative cultural things that are unhelpful and actually destructive of health and seeing other people? Could you share a couple of those things?
Yeah, also sorry if y'all are hearing, I think someone's like leaf blowing outside my house right now. But yeah, I mean, of course, Planned Parenthood, it's always been an uphill battle for us, whether that be against legislation or public opinion. That affects our way to be able to provide care for people, be able to access grants and funding. So I mean, I don't know how to be specific because there's always so many things, but we also have so many great supporters and team members and employees who help us fight the battle to be able to continue to provide this care.
I'm thinking about like the PRO Act or the Title 10 gag rule that they're taking comments on.
Yeah, so right now, Title 10 is a funding from the federal government that provides money to reproductive healthcare organizations. During the last administration, they had put a gag rule that said that any healthcare organization that provides any sort of abortion information or care cannot receive that money. So of course, Planned Parenthood was taken out because we provide abortion, and it's one of the things we're very proud of. And that lost a lot of money for us. And not only did it affect Planned Parenthood, but here in Minnesota, Planned Parenthood is actually the grant distributor of that. So we get the money from the federal government, and then we give that money to other clinics throughout the state. And because we were taken out, smaller clinics like in Duluth, St. Cloud, St. Peter, they were also negatively affected. So that gag rule didn't just affect us, but affected other places. Luckily though, right now we in this current administration are in the process of removing that gag rule. So we are in the middle of a 30-day comment period where general public can forward their comments to the administration about what they think should happen. And hopefully at the end of this month, that gag rule will be removed, and then Planned Parenthood will have access to millions of dollars again. And that money actually really helped us provide low-cost care for birth control. So while the gag rule was against abortion care, that money didn't actually go to abortion care. That money went to helping people who might not have the means to provide and pay for birth control to get that birth control free. So for the last 4 years, we really struggled to find different revenue sources. Unfortunately, some people had to start paying for the birth control that they might have been receiving for free for the last however many years of their life. But hopefully with the reversal of this gag rule, we'll get that money back and people will be able to have that affordable care again. And it's unfortunate because a gag rule like that can only be overturned by the administration, which is why it's so important that we have people in positions who are pro-choice and pro-reproductive health care to help us.
Would you put that website on the line someplace?
Yeah.
I can do that,
Grace,
Gary.
Can you do that, please?
Yeah, right now we have, Grace is gonna drop a link that is a very easy one to go. You type in your name, type in your email. You can customize your comment, but it would send comments to the current administration about what you think should happen to the Title X funding. So I sent one saying, remove the gag rule, let abortion care organizations access this money again. I don't know if they're really gonna read mine, but they might, because it's kind of like people sending them in.
And I think it's important to point out, I mean, people think Planned Parenthood and they think abortion, but it's like, it's actually a small part of what you do. It's important for those that it's, those who need it, who need that choice. It's important, but I mean, they test for STDs and cancer, and I mean, they provide people's primary health care in a lot of cases. It's got very little to do with abortion, but it does in a lot of people's minds. That's the main thing they associate with it, and it's unfortunate because it's really not a huge part of what they do for a majority of the people. So
we're very proud of all of our services, and like you said, so many things happen at a Planned Parenthood, from birth control, STI testing, counseling, different cancer screenings, vasectomies, hysterectomies, lots of different things are going on. And we just want to make sure everyone can get whatever they want. And yeah, so Grace dropped a link in the chat that y'all can follow to submit any comments you have about the Title X funding. And it would be great if you did any of that, because every comment's going to help us.
I sent it in already.
Okay, good.
One of the things that I have seen in minority communities, I've seen this in the gay community. I have people that I know that are transgender, and also people who are intersex. And there's often a real, well, they feel hurt by the things that people have said and done. And they're angry. And sometimes they're, I'm not saying they don't have a reason to be angry. They certainly, at least many of them do. But often they don't know who their friends are, I think, is part of it. And sometimes they strike out at people. I don't think it's indiscriminately, but probably quickly. And I'm wondering, how do you make sure that you're being in a supportive way and not come across as being, insensitive or whatever? You get the gist of what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah.
How do you get there so you're supportive instead of not?
That's a great question. I think first off, the fact that you're all here today is one piece of that you're taking time to try and learn, to try and understand. Like that's right off the bat. Some people will continue through their life and not try to explore and learn about just different identities and different things that are important to know. So number one, trying, but number two, just being open to growth. So like a lot of times, like we were talking about different, language that's important to use. There's so much and that's so hard because, we can only handle little things at once. So maybe trying different things like that, like saying like, I'm going to work right now on using words like transgender instead of hurtful words that might have been used in the past. So if you catch yourself saying something like that, like just flipping it, focusing on that one word, and eventually that will become, your normal language, and then moving to the next word, or asking for pronouns. If you meet somebody new, saying, and what are your pronouns? That could be one first task. So just trying small bite-sized pieces is so important. And before you know it, it'll just become second nature to you and you won't even realize it. And then lastly, too, just being open to taking feedback and learning from people. So, if you're in a space with somebody who is in the LGBT community and they say, we say something and that person responds like, oh, that's actually incorrect, or like, that's kind of hurtful, to say something like that. Understanding like they're just coming from a place of their identity, like maybe that hurts them, but they also are saying it because they want you to grow. So, take that as a compliment, because some people might just brush you off and think like, oh, like that person, they're never going to grow. They're never going to try to be better. But if someone is, correcting you or inviting you even into their identity, letting you know that that's who they are, that shows that you already have their trust, have their trust and their friendship, that they're willing to be open with you like that. Because there's a lot of people out there that hide themselves, hides parts of their identity and parts of their life. And two, just always, with anyone, being open in that way, saying like, I'm here to listen to you, here to learn more about you, whatever you want to share. So it takes time, but, the fact that you're trying and you do little things will eventually add up, and you'll try your best. And that's all that we can really ask of each other.
I think one of the,
Go ahead, Joel, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, one of the things that I've seen transgender people that I know in our parking lot, walking through type of thing. And there's a lot of times that I see the people as wanting to just be seen as a everyday person. They want to blend in. And I think that our church would really be a place where that can happen. But I don't know how to always be welcoming on this, because there's so many times that they've experienced the type of thing of saying, you're just trying to change me somehow.
Yeah, and that's so true just with religion in general, is that a lot of queer people might be a little more hesitant to enter into those communities just because of experiences they might have had in their own life, or just experiences they've heard from friends. And I think that's something that, you can work on with your church and with your community, figuring out ways that you're more inclusive, whether that be inviting those communities in, making sure you're using inclusive language. Just also like taking that extra step to invite them the same way you would anybody else. Community is so important, and also just being heard and felt and seen. So if a person, were to come to the church, but they're not feeling like they're being included in conversation, they're probably not going to want to come back. But if we work to make sure that everybody who is with us is truly with us, then that's one step right there.
I'm glad that you brought up words, because words are difficult, and changing our vocabulary is difficult. And you put up a list of words that binary people should not use, but wasn't queer one of those words? And you're using it a lot. And in my generation, it was an insult.
Yeah, so I myself am queer, so that's a really good word that feels good for me to use.
Okay.
Yeah, so I like that word. And it just is an umbrella term that I am comfortable using, but I also recognize that there are a lot of people that, yeah, that word could have been used really hurtfully against them. I myself have never had that experience, so I don't feel that negative attachment to it. But also when I just talk to people, especially older generations in the LGBT community, I recognize that that could have a lot of baggage to it. So when I'm around people like that, or I know people, I have friends who hate that word and will not use it. So I try not to use it around them either. But just also recognizing what feels good for people and trying to be as general as possible until we learn that about one another is how we can figure that out.
It reminds me years and years and years ago, my mother being upset because now we can't use the word gay because she meant that gay was to be happy, and she was upset. But it's a learning experience.
Yeah, so that's another thing too, just seeing the way that, sorry, my throat, seeing the way that words change. I had never known that gay meant happy until I think I watched West Side Story and they said it in it. Y'all are familiar with that musical, but I was like, huh? And then that's when I had learned that like, oh, that was a word before that had just meant excitement and joy. And now as time changes, as we had like discussed, cultural, gender, different words mean different things. And now when a person says gay, it usually means that they're referring to their sexual orientation rather than a feeling of excitement and joy.
Oh, that's really funny to me that you didn't know that part of it. That's
Yeah.
That exhibits the change right there.
Right. So true.
Well, out of respect for people's time, I would like to say we've been here about an hour. And I want to thank Mimi for coming and teaching us about the circles of sexuality, especially about gender and sexual orientation, and for unpacking these big ideas with us, because this is something that is changing quite a lot, frankly. The information on this is different. Like I remember when the word queer was being reclaimed and people were saying, nope, we're going to use that now because we won't let it hurt us. We're okay with who we are. And all of these things, pronouns are coming up more and more often. Church staff have them in their emails and on their name tags. And so I thank you all for being here to learn about how to be supportive and how to make our church an inclusive place and how to make your own loved ones feel appreciated exactly as they are. So thank you all. I hope you have a lovely Sunday. And if you have further questions, Mimi just put her email in the chat and I am happy to connect you to Mimi anytime.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.